we're not just talking about Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Usually when they say the law, it's actually the first 5 books of the Bible. That's really what the law of Moses is. So that's what Paul used. He used the law of Moses. This law, this quote-unquote Mosaic law that everybody says is done away with and that is nailed to the cross, that's the law that Paul used to prove that Yahusha, or the one they call Jesus Christ, was actually the Messiah. That does not sound like somebody who doesn't agree with the law or thinks that it's an evil thing or a bad thing or something that we shouldn't pay attention to. But that's just one example. I'm going to read to you a few other things that Paul said about the law. In Romans 7 and verse 12, he says, "Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good." And he says in Romans, actually I'm going to read that passage. I'm going to read Romans 7 verses 12 through 16. He says, "Therefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For what I am doing I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I will not do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me." So we see in this passage, Paul says repeatedly that the law is holy, the law is good. He says even that the law is spiritual. A lot of people teach you that the law is in some way carnal. They say you're being legalistic. They say that if you want to observe the law, that you're somehow anti the Messiah in some sort of way, or you don't have faith in him. But here we see Paul saying that the law is spiritual. Why is it spiritual? He explains in this passage that the sin is actually producing death in him. And why is it producing death? Because the commandment is showing him his sin. When you read a commandment, it reveals to you what's all messed up about your life. You recognize where you are falling short. If you don't read the commandments, you don't pay any attention to them, you will have minimal knowledge about where you fall short. Meaning you can't even ask for forgiveness because there are going to be things that you're doing that you don't even realize you're doing. There will be ways that you are displeasing the Most High, and you won't even recognize that you're displeasing the Most High because you're ignorant of his commandments. And so Paul in this passage, Romans 7, verse 12 to 17, he is talking about that whole experience of looking at the law, which is holy and just and good, and then recognizing within himself that he's worthy of death because he is breaking that which is holy and just and good by not keeping the commandments. And so he says the law is spiritual, but I am carnal. So again, this teaching that the law is evil, the law is bad, the law is against the Messiah is a false teaching. It's certainly not what Paul was saying. And finally, 1 Timothy chapter 1, I have up there verse 8, "But we know that the law is good if a man use it lawfully." But I'm also going to read a passage here. 1 Timothy chapter 1, and I want to read verses 8 through 13. Just bear with me while I turn to it. Hopefully you're spending this time finding it in your own Bible. Okay, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 8 through 13. It says, "But we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and for sinners, and for the unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for fornicators, for sodomites, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and if there is any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed Elohim, which was committed to my trust. And I thank Messiah, Yahusha, our Master, who has enabled me, because he counted me faithful, putting me into the ministry. Although I was formerly a blasphemer, a persecutor, and an insolent man, but I obtained mercy because I did it ignorantly and in unbelief. Here again, Paul's explaining what the law is for. The law, he says, is for the unholy and the profane. And he lists all these different things that qualify as unholy and profane. Fornication, sodomy, kidnapping, perjurers, liars. People like that. People like you and I. People who have fallen short. Have you ever lied in your life? Well, guess what? You need the law. Have you ever fornicated in your life? Guess what? You need the law. Have you ever done anything that is contrary to sound doctrine? Well, you need the law. That's what he's saying here. That is why the law exists. And he is talking about his own sort of salvation experience in realizing that he was a blasphemer and a persecutor, realizing that he himself was breaking commandments. He didn't realize it. He did it in ignorance when he was persecuting the church. He thought he was serving the Most High. He thought he was doing the right thing, just as many of us do. Many people think that by going to church every Sunday, or in some cases, some people go on the Sabbath, on the seventh day, that they're doing the right thing, that they're serving the Most High. Meanwhile, they may be jumping in and out of somebody's bed, or lying, gossiping, you name it, they're doing it, stealing, whatever, and thinking that they're okay. But Paul is saying that that's why the law exists. It's a mirror. It shows us where we're falling short. And in doing that, if we are sincere servants of the Most High, we're going to turn in the right direction, turn away from our sin, and then go, in fact, to the Messiah, who we need. We do need him. The law doesn't do away with him, certainly not, but it leads us to him to rely on his sacrifice, rely on his blood. But without the law, again, we're missing it, and we won't even know how deeply we need the Messiah. And so Paul says here, he obtained mercy because he did it ignorantly and in unbelief. There's a big difference between sinning on purpose, knowing full well that what you're doing is a sin, and then doing things ignorantly. And I have to say, having been part of churches for basically my entire life, churchgoers are often very ignorant of what's actually required by the law because they're not being taught. It's not necessarily their fault, but they're not being taught what the law requires. And so even though they consider themselves good people, holy people, righteous people, they're falling short on a daily basis of what is actually required of them. So again, this is just to make the point that Paul greatly respected the law. He thought of it as being spiritual, good, holy, and just. Moving on, in Romans chapter 7, he actually says, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Yah forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet." Again, it's just bringing out the same point. The law reveals sin. It shows you what you have to clean up to please the Most High. And then in Romans 2 and verse 13, it says, "For not the hearers of the law are just before Yah, but the doers of the law shall be justified." If you want to be justified, you have to do the law. It's not enough to just read about it, hear about it, kind of know about it, but you actually have to do it. These are the words of Paul, the one that people say taught that the law is done away with and is nailed to the cross. He's saying you actually have to do the law to be justified. Why is that? If we go to 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4, it says, whoever committeth sin transgresses also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law. Sin is, if those listening, if you hear nothing else that I've said in this entire presentation, please hear this. Sin is the transgression of the law. Every single time in the Bible where you see the word sin, it means the transgression of a law. It means somebody's broken a commandment. Somebody sinned, they broke a commandment. There's no other definition of sin, not another biblical definition. They're definitions that people have made up for their own vain philosophies. But the only biblical definition for sin is transgression of the law. So those who seek to do away with the law are, in essence, doing away with sin. They're saying there is no sin anymore. Because there's no laws, you can do whatever you want. And that is precisely why you see in so many churches all manner of evil running rampant. I mean, not even, it's not subtle anymore. It's not even hidden. You have pastors sleeping with their brother's wife. There's a pastor who is divorcing his wife, and who also happens to be the mother of his 10 children, and went off to lead a homosexual lifestyle and is trying to basically lead his congregation in the same direction. Those are just some examples. Then you have pastors who are robbing their congregations, living very lavish lifestyles while some of their members can't even pay their rent, and telling people that if they don't give them their money, they're not going to be blessed. There's all manner of evil because there's no law. Nobody's being taught the law, and so sin just runs wild in these congregations. And here's what Romans 8 verses 7 through 8 says. It says, because the carnal mind is enmity against Yah, for it is not subject to the law of Yah, neither indeed can be. So then they that are in the flesh cannot please Yah. So here we have a sharp contrast. There's the carnal mind, which is not subject to the law of Yah. What does that tell you? That if you are subject, if your mind is subject to the law of Yah, you do not have a carnal mind. You are now a spiritually minded person. So without the law, you're not spiritually minded. No matter how deeply you feel it, how much you think you are, how much you want to be a spiritually minded person, if your mind is not subject to the law of Yah, your mind is actually subject to the law of the flesh. And I can say this from experience, that's probably why you're having such a hard time with certain sins. You just can't get over it. You can't overcome it. You can't seem to break free of this thing, whatever it is. It's because you are a carnally minded person. Your mind is not subject to the law of Yah, and you can't please him. So the law, again, it's in another place says it's a schoolmaster. It leads us to the Most High. It leads us to the Messiah. It reveals to us who we truly are. And without that process, we can't even cry out for salvation. Not truly. We don't even see what condition we're in. And then finally, I just wanted to share with you how important the law is. Revelation 22 verse 15 says, blessed are those who do his commandments. Again, what did it say? It's the doers of the law, not the hearers of the law, that are justified. It says, blessed are those who do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates into the city. But outside are dogs and sorcerers and sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and whoever loves and practices a lie. I included some scripture on this slide, which are the actual commandments that are being described here, where it says outside the city are sorcerers. I include down there the commandments in Deuteronomy against sorcery. I include the commandments against sexual immorality, the commandment against idolatry and practicing a lie. I include all that down there simply to show you that outside of the holy city are going to be those that break the commandments. If anyone teaches you anything contrary to that, they're lying to you. Whether they're lying out of ignorance or lying out of, on purpose, they're lying to you. If you break the commandments, you're going to be outside that city. Messiah came and died. Yes, we need his blood, absolutely, because we've all fallen short, so we need his blood. But he did not suffer and die so that we can continue in our sin. Really, if you look at the life of the Messiah, his life and his death were fulfillments of the law. We see as a child how he was circumcised according to the law. He, throughout his life, observed the Sabbath, as we already talked about. He also observed the feast days from his youth, even onto adulthood, that time when he was 12 and he got left behind. That was on a feast day. It was one of those feast days where you had to be in Jerusalem. And he was there observing it with his parents. And later on in life, you see him going up for the Feast of Tabernacles and other feasts. I think there also shows him observing the Feast of Passover. And then even in his death, he died, and 3 days and 3 nights later, he was resurrected, which is according to the prophecy in Jonah. So all throughout his life, he kept the law and fulfilled the law. He was the Passover. He was the first fruits of the resurrection. In giving the Holy Spirit, he was keeping the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. And as I said earlier, this was a harvest of souls in addition to the actual physical harvest of wheat that they were reaping at Pentecost. And he's going to come again. And his second coming, it will fulfill the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and also the Feast of Tabernacles. So to say that the law is done away with means that the second coming is done away with. You really can't have one without the other. The Messiah is never going to break the very laws that he commanded to Israel. And so, in closing, I just want to say this. If you are in a house of worship that teaches you to ignore or break the commandments of the Most High, I exhort you to review Revelation 18 and verse 4, which says, "Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. For even the Messiah himself says, as recorded in Matthew 5, verse 19, whoever therefore shall break one of the least of these commandments and shall teach men to do so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." So this was a light lesson. It was long, but it was actually a light lesson. It just briefly touched on this idea of, the law after the resurrection. But I'm hoping that for those who are true novices and haven't really thought about this issue before, that it would be enough for you to dig in and really study this topic. Don't just listen to what people have told you in the past or what you've always heard. Pick up a concordance, delve in to the original meanings of those words, and really study this topic and see if you can, with a straight face, come to the conclusion that the laws were done away with by our blessed Messiah. And so on that note, I am wishing everybody shalom, and I look forward to sharing another lesson with you.